And I'm happy to welcome you to this distinguished author series event featuring Howard French, author of China's Second Continent, How 1 Million Migrants Are Building a New Empire in Africa. I was going to say, I forget if I was the savvy New York Times foreign editor who had the bright idea of sending Howard French to West Africa in the 1980s, but I do know I was the lucky New York Times foreign editor who during those years had the good fortune of having Howard French as the New York Times' West Africa bureau chief based in Abidjan. Of course, that only explains half of why Howard is so perfectly placed to have written this book. The other half is that he was later to become the New York Times' bureau chief in Shanghai. So the fact that Howard has well-tested insights into African and Chinese life, and that he speaks Chinese, lends real authority to the reporting that has produced this excellent book. And let me just stop at that point to say there are books for sale in the back, and I will make sure we get finished in plenty of time so Howard will have time to sign those books and chat with you when we get finished here. Though China is a place we associate with grand plans and possessive state oversight, Howard notes that this massive Chinese move into Africa has been very haphazard. So he gets the story by following these unpredictable paths on extended motor trips during an entire year through 9 African nations in East and West and Southern Africa. Howard, in effect, invites us all along for the ride, and it makes for a rollicking narrative which effectively illustrates his points, particularly to this reporter. I love stories like that, where you're talking to people and seeing things, and the reader can deduce what it is you're saying. But he'll pause from time to nudge the thinking with a well-placed analytical graph or two. I remember Howard telling me over dinner in Shanghai some years ago that he was embarking on a book about China and Africa, and I anticipated a book that would focus on the massive Chinese investment in Africa that I had witnessed in my own reporting trips to places like Chad and Sudan, and that prompted charges that the Chinese were just recycling the depredation of the continent that colonial Europeans had wrought a century earlier, exploiting Africans, extracting their natural and mineral wealth, and shipping all the benefits back to Lisbon, London, Brussels, and Paris. Well, Howard does discuss that phenomenon, though in a much more nuanced way than I just said it. But the real focus of the book is suggested by the title language about 1 million migrants building a second empire in Africa. Howard adds that 1 million figure is probably overly conservative, and it certainly is growing every single day. The Financial Times reported last month that over 2,500 Chinese companies have established themselves in Africa over the past 2 decades. China-Africa trade over the past decade has surged to $200 billion, up from only $10 billion in the year 2000. Now that's a 20 times gain in less than 14 years. No wonder that the first overseas trip of the new Chinese leader Xi Jinping last year was to Africa. Howard develops his storyline by talking to Chinese migrants themselves and to Africans about how they view their new Asian neighbors. Repeatedly, the Chinese tell them that they are in Africa to stay, and that they view Africa as offering them more freedom and opportunity than their own country, which they find overcrowded and hyper-competitive. In other words, the book is as insightful an observation about China as it is about Africa. Looking ahead 30 or 40 years, Howard writes, quote, "With 2 billion Africans, including vastly more people who will have attained middle-class status or better, and over 1 billion Chinese whose lives will be much more affluent, much more globalized, and deeply involved in every corner of the world, it is possible to imagine the unfolding relationship between Africa and China as one of the most important in the world." Howard, I am delighted to welcome you back to IPI, or to IPI, both because you are an old friend, but because you have written a really important book. Welcome, Howard French.
Thank you very much, Warren. It's really a pleasure to see you again. Warren he flubbed a few of the details, but he was instrumental in hiring me a long time ago. And for that, I'm truly grateful. It's all worked out pretty well.
Are you hearing Howard okay on the, or do you, I think you need to get that somehow closer to your mouth.
So how do I keep it out of my mouth at this point? Is this better? No? So it doesn't hold. It doesn't hold. If I let go, it springs back. Okay, so I've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a dialogue, and there'll be space for questions. And I wanted
a dialogue with all of you too.
What I'd like to do is kind of set the stage for a couple of things. First of all, I want to say how it occurred to me to write a book like this, and then I want to sort of frame the Chinese presence that I describe and that Warren correctly says that the book's title perhaps doesn't do sufficient justice to, in that we use the word 1 million in the title, and my guess is there may be, no one really knows. The Chinese state doesn't publish these figures. African states are not typically great data collectors, and there are many African states, and so it's very hard to derive a reliable number. My own sense is that probably 2 million is closer to the reality today than 1 million. But I want to paint a picture for you of the historical processes that put these people in motion and created this moment for us. The personal thing that happened to me is that starting in the New York Times, as a Shanghai bureau chief in the mid-2000s, I happened to work in an office complex in Shanghai that was one of the first international class post-reform era office complexes in the city. Shanghai now has many of these things, but it was called the Portman Center on Nanjing Road in Shanghai, and it happened to be so my office looked out over the entrance to the parking area of this hotel, and I literally began to notice, looking out the window, the arrival of greater and greater numbers of African visiting delegations. And it began to dawn on me after a while that there's something going on here. And nobody was writing about China, Africa then. But here are these heads of state visits taking place all the time. And typically they would come to Shanghai on their way to Beijing or stop in Shanghai on their way back from Beijing. And these heads of state were staying in this hotel complex where my office was. And so I began to scratch around and to try to get a sense of what's creating all of this momentum. And it turns out, indeed, that there are lots of things going on, including, of course, as Warren's data suggested, very rapidly growing trade between China and a great number of African countries. And so I proposed a series for the Times, and I set off and I did this series, and it focused on many of the questions that Warren said that he expected when he heard first from me that I was going to do a book, that he expected a book like this would tackle. What's the sort of nitty-gritty of the big state-to-state economic relationships, and what's the big macro picture in terms of geopolitics, et cetera. And so my series for the Times in 2006, I went to 3 countries and tried to talk to many other people, both Chinese, African, and non-Chinese or African, to kind of derive a general picture of this rapidly changing, rapidly growing relationship. I left the Times in 2008, joined the faculty of Columbia University to teach journalism there, and shortly after arriving there, Atlantic magazine asked me to do another large article about, so in the 2 or 3 years since the New York Times series had run, now it's become a popular subject. Lots of people are writing about this. And Atlantic asked me to go back, and so on this trip I traveled to 3 other African countries, this time overland by Chinese-built railroad, across Tanzania, all the way into the heart of Zambia, and then by road into Congo. And again, this big Atlantic piece was about some of these really big picture questions. What's happening in this relation? What's China after? What does this mean for us? What's the basis of all of this business that's being done between China and the African continent? But along the way, in these two reporting experiences, I had sort of had this growing sense of another important element in these. I say, for convenience sake, I'm talking about China and Africa as a relationship. But it's important to say parenthetically that there's no such thing as a China-Africa relationship per se. Africa is 54 countries, and China has a relationship with pretty much all of them, almost all of them. And the relationships vary. There are certain patterns that are common, but we're speaking in shorthand when we say the China-Africa relationship. Anyway, through these two trips, each of which took me, deeply into 3 countries. So by virtue of reporting in 6 different African countries over these 2 reporting exercises, I was sort of haunted by a phenomenon that grew right before my eyes. I mean, I noticed it with the New York Times series when I visited Ethiopia, Chad, and Malawi. And then 2 or 3 years later, when I went back for the Atlantic, visiting Tanzania, Zambia, and Congo, 3 very different countries, the thing that I had noticed was all that much stronger. And the thing we're talking about here, of course, is the presence of Chinese people, ordinary Chinese people, people who could be considered at a minimum long-term residents, who had come to do business, to seek their fortune in Africa, and in many cases should be spoken of as migrants. And this phenomenon was not the focus of either of my trips, and it had not really been the focus of any major piece of writing about China and Africa. And so I thought that this was could be an important window into understanding lots of things about what we're calling this relationship. And that set me along the path that ended up creating this book. I said I would talk about how we arrived at this historical moment, which I do a bit in the book. But I think this is very important for an American audience. It's important for an American audience, particularly right now, when we have a moment in Africa, namely in West Africa, in a place called the Gulf of Guinea, a very particular environment in West Africa. We have an epidemic of a disease called Ebola, which has come to color everything we think about Africa, every little ounce of attention that we pay to Africa, and where we quickly make an amalgam and we say, Africa, horror, this is Africa, disease, there's this awful thing coming from Africa, how do we stop Africans from coming here? How do we cut ourselves off from Africa? How do we distance ourselves from Africa? This is a reflex that exists very deeply in American society with regard to the African continent, that has a very long history and has powerful, pervasive effects that are relevant to the historical frame that I'm going to try to set for you. The historical frame is that China, beginning in the very late 1970s, picking up speed in the early 1980s, has something of a revolution policy-wise. China decides that it's no longer going to be, excuse me for repeating the word, but it's no longer going to be a revolutionary Marxist society. And it's going to set off in a direction of some new form of capitalism, both new for it and new for capitalism. And so China begins to experiment in a way that the Communist Party has shown a great talent for, with economic zones, very carefully at first, opening up little pockets of space in the country where they could have economic experiments. And the most important economic experiment of that time was attracting overseas capital for assembly industries that would produce in a capitalist mode and produce for export. Well, these special economic zones in places like Shenzhen, which is virtually on the border with Hong Kong, were a success beyond anybody. A lot of people in China at the time were opposed to this, that this is counter-revolutionary, that this will infect the society with bad ideas, bad morals, bad whatever. And so Deng Xiaoping and a few of his allies in this political fight within China prevail, but prevail only insofar as they were allowed to have small-scale experiments. The experiments take off. They do really well. The initial investments come from, in the very first stage, come from what's called overseas Chinese. Overseas Chinese, in the very first stage of this initial phase, were essentially from Hong Kong Chinese. So the money's coming from Hong Kong Chinese people to create factory investment in little tightly controlled special economic zones in China. That works well. The Chinese state says, well, we can expand it a little bit, maybe have some more zones, maybe attract capital from a few other places. And so the next place for overseas capital comes from another overseas Chinese community in Taiwan. So first they go to Hong Kong, lots of money comes in, it goes well, we can be a little more relaxed about this. Now we go to Taiwan, Taiwan money comes in, that goes really well. So they say we can expand yet further, and they go to places like the west coast of the United States, where there's a lot of expatriate or immigrant Chinese people with money, and places in Australia and various other places where you have these communities, and the money comes pouring in, and these experiments continue to take off. So that's essentially what was happening in the 1980s economically for China. The Chinese state knew that this recipe was working, but toward the end of the decade, they begin to realize they have the intuition that as successful as these experiments have been, they really can only carry the country so far. That special economic zones scattered in Guangdong province, which is the southern province next to Hong Kong, or in places like near Shanghai or along the East Coast, Tianjin, places like that, are producing lots of wealth, but they're only marginally affecting the lives of average Chinese people. There are a lot of Chinese people, and you're not going to employ all of them in factories like that, in constrained special economic zones. So as well as we've been able to, as fast as we've been able to grow, and as much money as we've been able to accumulate through this model, the Chinese leadership is thinking toward the end of the 1980s, we need something for the future. This is great for now, we need something for the future. And so the way the Chinese leadership comes up with policy is that they have what they call study groups. They have the small group for this, the large group for that, the leading group for this, what have you. And they get together and they debate ideas about what sorts of policy options are best for the country, and they have experts come and testify to them, and they gradually derive their policies that way. At the end of the 1980s, through this process, the Chinese leadership looks out around the world. They say, special economic zones cannot carry us too much further. We need to prepare a second step and a third step. What will those second and third steps be? And they said, one of the I'm doing this really quickly and simply, and we can get into greater detail if this interests you in the conversation, but one of the things they said is, in surveying the world, they said, there's this incredibly large space called Africa that nobody in the West is paying attention to. It has been completely abandoned. At the end of the Cold War, the Europeans, Western Europeans, turned to East Europe. Africa used to be their plaything. They colonized it. It belonged to them. Their companies dominated Africa, and the Europeans pulled out, and they said, go to Eastern Europe. You've got trained labor that's willing to work cheaply in markets that are right on our doorstep. And even for our political, and I'm not mocking this decision, there's a compelling logic to all of this. For our own security, we all know what happens when there's, poverty in Europe, and there's, people start shooting each other. It gets very ugly very fast. Let's go invest in these places. That's our priority. Well, what did the United States do? In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States begins to get carried along this course toward what we have come to know as the War on Terror. And I'm not going to talk at great length with you about that, but this involves a war in Iraq, it involves a campaign in Afghanistan, it involves a second war in Iraq, and now a third war in Iraq. And the United States its energies are projected very heavily in certain selected regions of the world where we have spent an enormous amount of treasure over these last years. And I'm not here to debate any of that with you. It's an uncontestable fact, right? What we did not do, and what the Europeans did not do, is think about Africa as a place with a future. Think about Africa as an economic space. Think about Africa in terms of markets. How did this occur to the Chinese? Two things happen. The first thing that happens is the Chinese understood the demographics of Africa were changing really rapidly. By 1990, anyone paying attention could have known this. that Africa was entering or about to enter into what is known by demographers as a demographic sweet spot, meaning that the ratio of people, according to different age groups, was ideal for a number of things. Ideal for labor productivity and ideal for consumption. Africa today has 1.1 billion people, according to one common estimate. Africa, by the middle of this century, will have 2 billion people. And depending on, these are UN figures, depending on, so there's a median, there's a high end, and there's a low end range projection. The farther out you project, the harder it is to achieve any degree of great accuracy in demographics. But just to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about, by the end of this century, Africa, by the median prediction, will have getting on to 4 billion people. That's more people than China and India combined. The Chinese understood this back in 1990, that if you want to sell things to people, you have to focus on where the people are. And Africa is where, between now and the end of the century, the marginal increase in human population is going to take place. Now, if it was just a matter of having more people, but it's all poor people who don't have any consumption power, it wouldn't be such a good bet. But it's much more subtle and more carefully worked out than that. China understood a couple of more things. China understood that the traditional markets that it had relied upon for these early phases of its takeoff, namely North America, Western Europe, and Japan, are markets with very bad demographics. These are markets that are aging, populations that are aging very fast, that also are heavily saturated in debt of one kind or another. And so as rich as they seem today, it did not seem like a great bet for China to say, let's stake our whole future on being able simply to sell stuff to those places forever. Meaning we have to look for other places to sell things, which led the Chinese which begins to lead the Chinese to bet on Africa. The next thing they understand is that while the West is ignoring Africa, lo and behold, there's this thing called a middle class sprouting up in lots of African countries. And because we have this inclination in this society, and this is very common in the West, to think of Africa only in terms of disease, in terms of mayhem, in terms of destruction, in terms of just essentially bad stuff. We don't have the antenna. We're not switched on to think in terms of Africa as being a place of opportunity. The Chinese said, look, the demographics aren't just good in brute numbers. The demographics are good. They're looking interesting already in terms of reasonably predictable trends, population ratio-wise and consumption power-wise. In other words, growth of middle class. One final piece. In the late 1980s, when the Chinese leadership is trying to decide what a smart strategy will be for the second and third phases of Chinese takeoff, they said, the first phase, this special economic zone phase that I described at the beginning, is relying on other people to come in and make stuff with their designs and their capital. We're getting wages from that. We're getting, creating various inputs, but typically very simple and low profit inputs for this thing. But this isn't something that's going to create, if we don't do anything different, great added value for us in the long term. The only way for us to rise up the value-added chain is to have our own companies going out into the world, investing in other places, creating brand equity for products that are Chinese designed and Chinese built and Chinese financed elsewhere in the world. This is where the profit lies. This is the way we create wealth that is substantial enough that it can be spread widely in Chinese society and not just be a phenomenon limited to isolated economic zones along the eastern seaboard of China. China looks around and it says, who has ever succeeded in doing this before? And a couple of examples are pretty obvious that come to mind. Well, Japan, if you remember, if you can think back to the 1950s, it begins in the 50s and really picks up pace in the 1960s and 70s. Japan did this before. Japan said, starting with some somewhat different fundamentals. Japan has never been a country the size of China and never will be a country the size of China. But so it didn't have the domestic market that China has. It doesn't have the labor force power that China has, et cetera. But some of the problems that China had, Japan also had at a similar phase of development. We can't just be a place that absorbs other people's capital to build stuff. Japan used to be dominated in the 1950s by companies like Xerox, by Ford Motor, et cetera. They said, we need to go out and exert our economic power elsewhere and get people to consume our designs as a way of rising up the chain. Japan went head to head with the best American companies, and it was brutal at first. I was in high school in the 1970s, and friends who had Japanese cars, friends whose families had Japanese cars, were the butt of jokes back in. I don't know how many of you can remember this, but to have a Japanese car at a certain time was like a sign of, either something's wrong with you or, something's going to be wrong with your car. Through persistence and ingenuity and all the rest, that actually changed pretty quickly. The next people to try that, and many of you wouldn't have occurred to you. You'll instantly, if you're all of a sufficient age for the most part, to get this. But the next country, surprisingly, was Yugoslavia. There was a car called the Yugo.
Oh, remember it.
That the Yugoslavs, there is no longer a Yugoslavia. That the Yugoslavs said, we'll go straight into the American market and try to make a go of this. And they tried to sell this Yugo car, and they did whatever they could flogging this thing, and the car was just no good, and it went nowhere, and the company went belly up, and that was the last of we heard of the Yugo. Now there's no more Yugoslavia, right? Well, the Chinese look in 1980s, end of the 1980s, and they say, not through any lack of self-confidence, just out of cleverness. Why do we need to go head-to-head so we know we need our own brands, we know we need our own designs, we know we need to rise up the value chain. Why is it necessary for us to just go head-to-head in the richest, most competitive markets in the world against the very strongest brands in history, when there are these spaces in the world that are not contested by those companies and those brands? And the biggest single space that fits that description is Africa. And so when I'm traveling around Africa for my Atlantic Magazine piece, by this point, I'm going into places like Lubumbashi in southern Congo and seeing Chinese cell phones for sale for $15 in little marketplaces in Lubumbashi, brands you would never have heard of, some brands that would even make you laugh, like knockoffs of other designs that are picking up names that are familiar to all of us. In the idea that, so if you use a Chinese name, and this phase is over, by the way. This was in 2008. The scene has moved on well beyond this. But in 2008, there are cheap Chinese brands trying to make it this way and figuring we don't have the money to really market ourselves, even in Africa, in a relatively uncompetitive environment like this. Let's just slap on some combination of familiar sounding names that more or less we've stolen. So Sony, Nokia. You'll see a phone that says Sony Nokia, right? For sale for $12, right? The bigger point here is that now you have Chinese brands that are branding in their name in Africa, very high quality. I'm sorry that I just bought an Apple phone, the new iPhone, but for the last 6-8 months, I've been walking around with one of these phones. And I bought it because I had an iPhone 4, but I travel out of the country a lot. I don't want to remove the SIM card from my phone, so I need a second phone. And I was in China in March or February, and I went into a phone stall and I bought a Haier phone. Now, how many of you know Haier as a company? H-A-I-E-R. Haier is like a conglomerate that's most famous in this country for selling refrigerators. They don't have a background in making phones. Haier says, we're going to make phones, and we're going to sell phones in Africa, and we're going to create brand equity with this. Haier is one of, I could give you 100 examples like this, right? Chinese companies that said, we're going to build brand equity today, just like Yugo tried in the United States, just like Toyota tried before Yugo in the United States, but in an environment that is generally uncompetitive because all the West can think of about Africa right now is Ebola. All the West can think about Africa last week was some other problem. All the West can think about Africa next month is some other problem. Okay, let them think that way. We're going to build brand equity right now. It might take us a generation, but in 2050, when there's 2 billion Africans, today there are more middle-class Africans than middle-class Indians. In 2050, when there's how many more middle-class Africans than Indians, they will be used to buying our brands. And, you know, that looks like a fairly reliable baton for us. To pick up the baton in a relay race, we've made it through phase one. Phase one went pretty well. Doesn't mean the Chinese don't want to compete in Western Europe or Japan or North American markets, but they've seen beyond that, and they have chosen Africa as a special economic space to achieve their ambitions because they can see the world without some of the baggage that Westerners have vis-a-vis Africa and some of the stereotypes that Westerners have vis-a-vis Africa. I think I've probably talked for 20 minutes.
I'll just keep it going. Now, that was a good exposition. A question from reading the book that will fit in perfectly there. For instance, discuss a little bit the problems the Chinese have had in Africa. And by that I mean the problem of bringing their own workers there and therefore not giving jobs to Africans. The problem of making shoddy goods for a while, which were distrusted, and the problem basically of not really assimilating in these societies, but having sort of Chinatowns everywhere, and the problems that would have created culturally with the resident Africans. And then in that same context, I know what the Americans have been doing, seeing this phenomenon. The Americans, including Hillary Clinton one time, have been warning Africans against the wily Chinese. You know, they will destroy your environment, they will extract your minerals, they will not give jobs to your people. How did that happen, and where does that stand right now? Have the Chinese adjusted their approach so that those complaints are no longer valid, or are those complaints that Africans are making about the Chinese takeover of some of their businesses and societies?
So you've asked me a lot of questions.
I'm sorry, I know.
And I'm not
trying to take the thing on the arc you were taking.
I'm not sure where to begin, actually, but I think I should maybe start with the Hillary thing and then get back to the Chinese.
Yep.
So, for me, what Hillary Clinton said about Africa to African audiences really showed me, most of all, the complete disconnection that exists in American policy circles toward Africa. The idea that Africans are just waiting to be told what to think about what's happening in the world, and that you can just sit there and say, that in some, it is so paternalistic. Be careful for this guy or that guy because we all know that they're really dangerous. Well, that's ignoring a bunch of things. First of all, it is treating Africans as if they don't live in the same world that you do and that they don't have the power to observe and to come to their own decisions. But it's also assuming that they assume that you have their best interests in mind. And that's not always a safe assumption. So the Africans have not had a good experience, generally speaking, with the West. Mm-hmm. The West has simply not been a good partner for Africa in many ways. It depends. We can, divide this conversation up into trenches and say, okay, tell me what period of history you want to talk about. But most of them are not good. And so having Hillary Clinton come and say, beware of the Chinese, to an educated African audience actually doesn't take a special level of education. Is like setting off alarm bells. It's like, who does she think we are? Having said that, I do not wish to pretend that the problems that you cited are not real issues. Mm-hmm. Africans don't need Americans to come tell them that having Chinese companies arrive with 2,000 workers to build a stadium in which some of the workers are completely unskilled, they're pushing wheelbarrows, is a good thing. They don't need to be told that's a bad thing. African countries generally have very high unemployment levels. African countries generally are seeking partnerships people are seeking partnerships that are going to increase local wealth. And the Chinese pattern, and we have to, just like I said, you can't really talk intelligently at any level of subtlety anyway about China, Africa. You have to be, you have to get down to cases. It's also, one also has to be careful speaking about China's own approach to Africa. There are many different things happening. There are many different actors. So this construction business that we are talking about is typically state construction. So Chinese state companies are coming in and they are bidding for, through internal, non-transparent, non-competitive Chinese processes for construction work that will be funded by Chinese state banks. And they're bringing in, so the way this typically happens is that, and I have not reported this piece, but I have sufficient reason to believe that this is an opportunity for great corruption within China. Mm-hmm. So you have a short list in China. You have a state bank like they're called policy banks. So the China Development Bank, for example, that are state-run banks that are run with Chinese foreign policy imperatives as their priorities. And so in the mid-1990s, I didn't finish telling you the story. In the mid-1990s, the Chinese state literally fixed Africa as a priority. The Chinese state had a general policy which was announced called Go Out, meaning we can't simply be the recipients of other people's globalization. It's time for us to go out and begin globalizing other people. And within that context, Jiang Zemin, who was the president then, said we must make Africa a priority. Okay, and so the way Chinese politics works is that officials in various areas, whether it's the county, the province, or whatever, the city are ranked, they're graded in large part by their economic performance. And so if the state sets a priority that says you must engage with Africa, then the state then begins to grade governors on the degree to which they engage with Africa. And so you saw in the mid-1990s this rush by Chinese at the provincial level, where you have state companies that are provincially based or provincially constituted looking for business in Africa. And they didn't know what to do at first. And the first thing that occurred to them is, there's no infrastructure here. We can build infrastructure. China was in the midst of the biggest infrastructure boom the world has ever seen itself. We've got tons of infrastructure capacity. Africa has zero infrastructure, not literally, but has great insufficiency of infrastructure. We can build infrastructure. And so provinces begin competing for this business. Central Chinese government-owned or controlled banks begin financing this business. And the way it worked is that they would set up a list with 3 or 5 pre-approved companies. And the company, a group of people would meet in Beijing and say, so what do you think we can sell to Ghana? What do we think we can sell to Zambia? What do you think we can sell to Tanzania? And in some closed-door process, they'll come up with a list. We can do a stadium for them. These guys, they need a port. We can do an airport for these people. The other ones, they need a highway system. We will pre-approve the firms that will be allowed to do this, and will come essentially with a fait accompli, like a ready-made package for the African partners. That's how this worked for the first 10 years or so, starting in the mid-1990s. And the Africans, having been so left out of the loop of the global economy by Europeans and North Americans since the mid-80s, were just so tickled to have anybody paying attention to them that they didn't ask hard questions. Where do we sign? Yeah, okay. I'd like to have a highway. I'd like to have a port. I'd like to have a stadium. I'd like to have a whatever, hospital. Where do we sign? And next thing you know, you saw 2,000 Chinese workers coming in to build this thing according to the terms of the contract. Typically, you must, very short completion times. Within a year or two, the whole thing is delivered, right? And the Chinese would trumpet this as being win-win. Look, you guys paid with 20 years of your copper exports and you got a new railway system. We're both winning, right? Well, so that model begins to be overcome a bit by African civil societies starting in the middle of the last decade. And this is still a process that's underway and gathering strength. These kinds of deals typically are struck in a non-competitive, non-transparent way, in the sense that the packages are made in China without much consultation with the African counterparties. And the deals are struck with governments that, whether or not they're formally democratic or not, and there are a lot of formally democratic countries in Africa that have elections, that have opposition parties, that have opposition newspapers and the rest, but business at a high level is still conducted in a very untransparent way, and dominated by the state house, dominated by the president and his clan. And so the Chinese side comes in and says, look, we've got this great package, we've pre-approved, you pick one. We've pre-approved 3 companies, you pick one. It's not an open bid, it's not an international bid. You pick one. The African side goes, okay, pick this. And in 2 years, you have your hospital or your railway or whatever, right? 2,000 guys come in from China, they build the thing really quickly, win-win, everybody's on TV smiling together, the Chinese side goes back. Some of the Chinese people go back. Many of the migrants actually arrived this way, right? Africans did not begin to question this model because Hillary Clinton told them that it was a bad thing. Africans began to question this model because they saw a lot of the byproducts of this model. First of all, they saw that there was no, there were no intellectual property or like human resource skill transfer, right? The blush of excitement wore off. The people in the State House might have been getting a little cut or rich or making, benefiting for themselves, but it was not being spread very far. And there was no great turnover in terms of the payoff for the rest of the society. So I was in Kenya for much of this summer. This spring, the Chinese premier flies into Kenya. He signs this big deal to build a gigantic new railroad project in Kenya. Everybody, all of the official rhetoric is about win-win, isn't this wonderful? The Kenyan press was just full of scathing commentary about how could we do this X number of years after we've seen this kind of package in country after country after. How could our government have agreed to something like this, where there's no training, there's no technology turnover, we don't have any engineers participating in this project? I'm trying to answer a question that had many different elements to it. But
you're answering it just the way I hoped you would. I haven't been your editor for 30 years, but I knew asking that question about Hillary Clinton would get just that answer.
The value proposition goes something like this. You don't have a railway, you need a railway. Let's use a highway system, it's a better example. Highways are the biggest single thing that's being built. African countries definitely need roads. The Chinese side comes in, they give you a package for a road, and in counterpart, you pay very often with 20 years of production of some mineral, bauxite, cobalt, copper, what have you. Now, at a very simple level, it's easy to sell this notion of win-win. The Chinese will comply. They will give you the road. They will do what they signed for. They are completely fair in terms of respecting the terms as signed for, right? And they'll deliver the thing, if not early, on time, right? However, if you haven't had an engineer trained, if you've had no technical transfer of knowledge, if you've had no internal transformation, well, what do you think the average life of a highway is in a tropical environment? I'm literally asking you the question. Anybody have a guess?
2 years.
So in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries where it rains, and it rains in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and a Chinese engineer told me this, a guy who's building one of these roads in Ghana. He said the average lifespan of a highway system is 7 or 8 years. So if you haven't gotten any human above ground wealth created, by which I mean human resource strengthening and expertise, and you've signed away 20 years of a vital and perishable good for something that's going to only last 7 or 8 years, you've come out behind. You've actually hurt yourself. Mm-hmm. The Chinese didn't cheat you. That's what they told you they were going to do. They delivered the thing on spec, right? But in the initial blush, from mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, one country after another said, where do we sign, where do we sign, where do we sign? And after a decade of this thing, seeing many of these trade-offs that are negative trade-offs for Africa, people in African societies, civil society especially, are pushing back, are asking questions, are creating pressure on the government for more stringent conditions that create more opportunity for Africans to rise up their own value chain of expertise, to involve local contractors in these businesses. The Chinese objection, and I don't blame the Chinese for taking this stance. Look, we want to get this done for you really quickly. It'll be much more efficient if we just use our people, et cetera, et cetera. But the Africans are saying, no, that's not good for us. Just having it quickly is not the only criterion for evaluating the value of something like this.
So won't the Chinese have to adjust to that? In other words, if Africans now have wised up and will demand things like training and technology transfer and jobs for their own people, the Chinese will have to keep the business, will have to adjust to that, won't they?
So this adjustment is underway. The sad reality, though, is that there are not a lot of options for the Africans. In other words, the West is generally not competing for this business. What you are beginning to see, in the infrastructure sector, is a kind of assortment of other non-Western countries that have understood that there's great fortunes to be made in this, and that the Chinese have it all to themselves, and that they should be in the game too. And so Turkey and India and Vietnam and Brazil are saying, look, there's a lot of money to be made in infrastructure in Africa, and we should be able to compete for that. Africa needs that kind of competition. It's not simply enough to say to the Chinese, look, this isn't a good deal for us. If you don't have any other form of leverage, you're going to have a hard time obtaining better terms. And so this is another problem with Hillary Clinton's rhetoric. So I describe in Mali, arriving in Mali, and I had not had in my research, had no inkling that this was going to happen to me. I landed in Mali to report for the book, and I come out of the airport. Hadn't been to Mali. Mali is a country I love and have spent lots of time in over the years, and I had not been there for quite some time. And I come out of this, I land, and there's a nice international terminal, which surprised me, and it was very efficient, and I walk out. And so I'm wondering, where did this come from? And it was very well run, and I get out really quickly, and I'm standing out, and a driver was supposed to meet me, and I walk outside, and I don't immediately see the driver. All around the entrance to this very nice international terminal building are, construction hoardings and, barricades and things like this, and I look around, and I see a plaque. And so the plaque says that right next door to the international terminal is another terminal being built, I guess a regional terminal, that is funded by the United States. And at the bottom in smaller letters in Chinese, which I can read, it says that the work's actually being carried out by a Chinese company called Road and Bridge. And so and this is all funded under the something called the Millennium Challenge Account, which is a vehicle for American aid to economic assistance to Africa. So I go to the American embassy for other reasons, to talk to them about a bunch of stuff, and I raised this to them, and there was 4 or 5 officers of the embassy around the table, and you could just feel the sort of body language change in the meeting. I'm like, why is the Millennium Challenge Account funding the value of this airport terminal? I don't remember off the top. It's in the book, but a very large sum of money. We're talking a couple $100 million, right? So why is there Chinese? Listen, I'm not against Chinese companies having business. It's not the point of the remark I'm about to make, but you will never find a circumstance where China funds something for Africa where it's going to be an American company that's going to be the contractor. I promise you, okay? And so I asked, it was just a natural question. I said to the embassy, like, what's going on with, why is the Millennium, it just surprised me that this could exist. The Millennium Challenge Account is funding a Chinese contract to build a new airport. And so the answer, to sort of come straight to the point, is they claimed, and I believe they're telling me the truth, because I've encountered the same thing in other countries, and I did a little scratching around in Washington before writing. They claimed that even at a cost of $200 million project of U.S. government guaranteed financing, They couldn't find American companies that were interested in going to Africa to do this kind of work. We're back to what I said about Ebola. We have our own infection, and it's an infection of a kind of mental picture of Africa that does not allow for the possibility of lucrative economic activity or anything that does not involve rescuing people. That's where we are vis-a-vis Africa. And so, I'm sure that if you looked around, you could find plenty of American companies that would love to have a $200 million construction contract, but connecting them to Africa was too hard. And so Congress put an end to this. When they found out that this was happening, somebody in Congress said, we have to pass a bill saying that, no, they couldn't have a bill that said you can't have a Chinese contractor. So the way that they put a stop to it is say that anyone, that in order to qualify for this kind of business, you cannot be a state-owned company. They knew that all the Chinese construction companies were state-owned companies. So this brings us back to Hillary. So Hillary says, be careful, the Chinese, they're going to pick your pocket, they're going to do all these bad things to you. Well, what are you offering us? Are you in the picture? What are you doing?
Howard, you talk, since you speak Chinese, and the book is very much, Howard, it's a reporting book. It's, to call it a travelogue would be insulted, but it's very picaresque. It's Howard is driving around, and he basically says, I see this guy, I stop the car, I get out, I talk to him. And the Chinese people you speak to you very candidly about their attitudes about Africans. And it's not nice. It's Africans don't fend for themselves. Africans depend upon their governments to do everything. You even say you have to point out a few times to people, well, they have built these buildings. They do farm the land. They feed themselves, because you find in the Chinese population an attitude that Africans are almost childlike in their inability to manage themselves. The question is, does that have to change? I mean, can the Chinese maintain that attitude about Africans and still enjoy success there, or will that begin to change? Will Africans demand basically more respect?
A few things have to be said here. One of them is, and I'm sorry to keep saying things like this, but one of them is that we must recognize in discussing this that we have this legacy ourselves.
Sure.
So, if you know anything about the Belgian Congo or about, that's only the most notorious example. This is the legacy of Western involvement with Africa, of talking about Africans like they're worthless and that, they'll just never get it. And, the Europeans in the 1950s didn't think Africa would be independent before the end of the century. They had no concept of that possibility, because they didn't think Africans had, they just weren't there in their view. They just were not there psychologically or mentally, right? And so I think it's important not to particularize Chinese in this regard. The Chinese are coming to Africa, and we're talking about the immigrants who populate my book. They come from two different kinds of phenomena. The first is they are the workers who came on these projects to build railroads and ports and hospitals and the like. They come at 200, 500, 2,000 a pop, and they're there for 2 years, typically to do a contract. And at the end of these contracts, beginning in the mid-1990s, some small percentage of these people, they arrive in Africa with great prejudice and lack of information. These are ordinary blue-collar workers, tradespeople, as you say. And they knew nothing about Africa, or if they knew anything, what they knew was rank stereotype. Just like many Westerners have rank stereotype. Like, did you see any lions? Is it safe there? Those sorts of things. And so these people come and they arrive and they spend 2 years doing their contract, and they discover, wow, I didn't get chased by a lion. Nobody beat me up. The food is edible. The air is actually really nice compared to China. There's a lot of open space, there's land, there's businesses that I can build. And so 1%, 2%, 3% of the people from these work crews would stay on. They would finish their contract and decide not to go back to China. This becomes the first motor of Chinese migration to Africa. And many, many, many thousands of Chinese who are there today arrived that way. Many of the people we're talking about who are using this, who I witnessed using this very ugly, patronizing language, come from this kind of background. It must be said that they typically use that language only in Chinese. Speaking among themselves, they don't go around town speaking in the official local language. I don't think, for the most part, being quite so open in terms of their contempt or patronizing airs, right? But the next thing that happens is that as some of these people begin to succeed, they're using social media. You know, the working man social media in China up until not too long ago was something called QQ. It's kind of a combination of Messenger and Skype, and every Chinese person up until a few years ago, now there's newer, more popular things, but was using QQ to communicate back home. And so some ordinary guy from Hubei or from Sichuan who was just a worker, like a cement mixer or a bricklayer, right? Now he has 5 cars on his own business and, property. And he's sending pictures of this stuff back home. And how do you think people back home respond to this? So he comes from a given social milieu, let's say, real sort of basic working class. And his neighbor sees the pictures, and the neighbor's saying, hey, Joe's not smarter than me. If he could go to Africa and become rich, I can do that too. What am I here in China for, sweating it out, like working in this really crowded, hyper-competitive place with bad air pollution? Joe's got 5 cars and the skies are blue in all of his pictures and he's got green land around him. I'm going to go there too. This has become the bigger phenomenon, so in my view. And so this is what has created this real flow of heavy, steady flow of China. It's emulation. It's a pull factor. Like he can do it, he did it, I can do it. And everyone doesn't succeed, but every one success story conceivably could pull 5, 10, 12 new people who want to do better, right? So these are the people who are coming. And because they have pulled up their stakes typically, and their stakes are small and they don't have any safety cushion, these people are going to do anything they can to succeed. Sometimes they come thinking they're going to do one profession and that doesn't work out and they switch to something else. And they'll do this, they'll try anything to succeed. The worst thing to do is to go back to China having failed, because you're going to be the laughing stock of your community that way. But to come specifically back to the sort of racial aspect of your question, China and the United States resemble each other in some ways that are not, this thing is driving me crazy, but, that are not generally appreciated. Can you all hear me now? Okay, we'll carry on like this. We both believe in our own propaganda, right? So Americans, we're the country of, all these wonderful things that we do for everybody else, and we have all these wonderful values. Well, the Chinese don't believe in those same details. But the Chinese buy their own myths just as readily as we buy our own myths. And one of the myths that is most current among Chinese people is that Chinese people work harder than other people. That Chinese people have more willpower than other people. That Chinese people have more grit. That we can put up with anything. Look at those Europeans, they're just so lazy. If it was a Chinese person doing this, there's no way we would ever be frustrated, because we just have willpower, right? So a lot of...
We eat bitter.
We eat bitter.
Yep.
Thank you. So that's the phrase in Chinese that is actually used. And so a lot of this is actually about that. It's not... So there is some rank stereotype and actual racial feeling involved, but the bigger piece of what we're talking about is about everybody. It's not just about, Chinese are not just racist about Africans. Chinese believe they're better than everybody. Mm-hmm. They really do. And they have always believed that. And they will always believe that. Really. And that's a strength of China. It has a civilizational self-belief that has carried it through really, really awful periods. That, so the last 100 years ago, 50 years ago, China was not doing well, right? But Chinese still believe we're the best, we're the greatest, we have the greatest civilization, we're the smartest. I have to tell this final anecdote. Before I arrived in China, my last few months I was in Japan before going to China. I was in Japan for 5 years, China for 6 years. My last few months in Japan, I started studying Chinese. I had a tutor come to my house, and she's teaching me Chinese. And after, I don't know, 3 or 4 sessions, I guess she felt she was sufficiently comfortable to tell me the truth. She had a question. She had a question and she had an assertion. The question was, how much money do you make? Which culturally in China is not an inappropriate question. Chinese people are very direct about this. Okay, but the assertion was, Mr. French, I just want you to be prepared for the fact that Chinese people are the smartest people in the world, and that China is the greatest country in the world, and that if it doesn't look that way today, you need to be getting ready for that, because that's what it's about to be. And I, and this is very deep and very widespread, and people at different levels of sophistication will be more or less careful in saying that, but these beliefs are very widely held. So it's not just about, look at the poor Africans, at all.
I hear you. I'm going to go get some questions from the floor. One bear in the back, and here in the 1, 2, 3.
Can I be first, please?
No, I've already called on 3 other people.
I have to leave. I'm leaving for Boston in like 5 minutes, and I just.
Well, then I guess I can't say no to that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
But please make it quick, because there are a lot of people who want to ask questions.
Well, I really appreciate
And
what you're
please
saying.
identify yourself.
My name is Mardia Stone. I am from Liberia, the Ebola land. And I just want to say I appreciate what you're saying in your book, because we see the same things happening in Liberia. And I bought the book. I'm on my way to Boston for World Mental Health Day tomorrow at Mass General Hospital. And I have to leave in 5 minutes, and that's the reason I interrupted. Sorry about that.
That's correct.
So please
Thank
sign
you.
my book.
Oh, that's fine. If that was your question. All right, we'll start, Harvey in the back.
What is the name?
Mardia.
Okay. Okay, this is a first. This is a first, but you've got something on your leg too. We can have the other question coming.
Howard, Harvey Dupiton.
Harvey, identify yourself, please.
Harvey Dupiton. I work within the NGO community here at the UN. But of course, you probably would have known me as someone dealing on Haiti.
Today's Haiti.
Howard, should we expect any major policy change, U.S. policy change towards Africa? Because we've grown accustomed to, Haitians that is, have grown accustomed to reading you, and now that I'm finding out that Orrin Hodge was also behind this, to signal some type of major policy change on Haiti. This propaganda, either that when we read you, either this thing, the leaders, if they, in any case, so. But if not, coming here, I thought I was expecting to hear something different. Something, should African be concerned about the flow of migrants there? You spoke quite a bit about the pioneering of China. We know that, but should Africa be concerned about the fact that China has taken the lead, to do work in Africa?
I'm going to stop you there. You've got that question. Hang on to it. Second, I think, yes, there you are. I have to ask sort of 3 at once because of so many people want.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jinglan. I come from China. Oh, sorry. My name is Jinglan. I come from China, and I really appreciate what you describe about the situation in Africa. And my question is, I study multicultural counseling in Columbia University, and I know, as a Chinese, Chinese migrants or immigration never have trouble to make a living or even making wealth in foreign countries. But on the other side, it's always culturally very reserved. They don't really integrate with the local community, and also it's kind of create their own community everywhere else in the world. So I wonder what's the situation in Africa, and how was the cultural interaction or just general interaction between local people and the Chinese migrants?
Okay, you got that? And third, the gentleman on your left, and then we'll answer all 3 at once.
Hello, my name is Joel with UN.
Hold it a little closer to your mouth.
Yeah, my question actually has to do with Africa relation. I'll put it this way. You said Africa has 50 plus countries, so you have to do the relationship with each of them. My question in regards to European invasion in Africa, how does China dictate the relationship with each country? Is it based on the number of natural resources, the quantity of wealth of natural resources, the oil? And what does that have to do with the China policy of non-interference?
Okay, we'll take those three questions, Howard, quickly, because we've got a whole bunch of other questions.
So should Africa be concerned about China taking the lead? I'm not, taking the lead is a hard to define thing. I'm not completely won over to the view that China's taken the lead in Africa. So China has shown up, has reappeared in Africa in the last 10, 15 years, right? The West has enormous advantages in Africa still. Every African country has, as its official language, a European language. That's an incredible advantage. The cultural references that Africans have are Western cultural references. China could work for 200 years, and I'm not confident that it would ever be able to supplant those kinds of cultural references. The West has, as absent as I had described the West in infrastructure investment in Africa presently, most of the infrastructure we see in Africa, big-scale infrastructure, was built by the West. So China is doing all of the West, the recent stuff that you're seeing, all of the big, speedy change that's taking place. But this has to be measured against the stock of infrastructure and construction of the last 100 years. And I'm not simply prepared to say that China has taken the lead. I do not think that most African countries see China as its leading political partner yet, by any means. And so China has become a very important player, and China has become a key factor in many African countries and in the internal dynamics of these countries and globally of the continent. But I think you have to have a somewhat different perspective. Do Chinese people integrate? I'm not sure how much Westerners have integrated in Africa, and I keep coming back to this comparative thing, but we have to be fair to our questions. Westerners have not typically gone to Africa and just sort of said, let's mix with the Africans. Westerners have gone to Africa typically and reconstituted their own communities in Africa as well. Exclusive suburbs, in some countries actually legally separated communities, and intermarriage, when it happens, very much on their terms. So Chinese people are coming to Africa. It's a stereotype of Chinese emigration culture that Chinese people form Chinatowns. But there are not a lot of Chinatowns in Africa. And if that prompts me to think about, well, why do you have Chinatowns in the West? Chinatowns in the West, the old Chinatowns that were formed in the West, were formed as a result of a kind of apartheid that existed in Western societies. Chinese people were not welcome in many places. And this is not the only reason they constituted Chinatowns, but it was an important reason why they constituted Chinatowns. We're not welcome, we don't have, the door is not open to us in ordinary common society, so we're going to constitute our own community. We also, as Chinese people, like to celebrate our own culture, and we value our identity. And so these three things combine to create Chinatowns in places like San Francisco or New York City, et cetera. Those factors don't exist. The first of those factors don't exist in Africa. Africans, by and large, have not treated Chinese people with racial contempt and have not sought to impose legal exclusion on the movement or residence or behavior of Chinese people. And so you do not have that impulsion toward a Chinatown in Africa. And I only know of 2 or 3 relatively small examples of anything in the 17 countries I visited for this book that could even vaguely be referred to as Chinatowns. I found lots of examples of Chinese people having, a lot of people ask me, so do you see couples? Do they have children? Well, I don't know how you get 1 million people going somewhere and not having children. I mean, I just can't imagine that. I mean, can you? you know, 1 million people from wherever go some other place, some of them are going to start having children with the people in that place. That's just normal. And that's true with China too. And so there's examples of these people in my book. And some of them are doing it because they simply found a partner that they liked, and some of them are doing it because this is legally convenient for them. That in order to gain entry into the country legally, or to be able to buy land and control land, they needed to have a local partner. And I don't mean partner in the sense of soulmate. I mean partner in the legal sense, right? So you see these things happening.
Last one.
The last question was, I'm sorry, the last question is escaping. How does China decide to deal with the 54 different countries in Africa? So, you know, a lot of the countries, when I chose which countries to go to, I wanted a mix, according to a lot of different criteria. I wanted geographic balance. I wanted some really big countries population-wise, and I wanted some small countries, and I wanted some resource-rich countries, and I wanted some not resource-rich countries. And what I found out is that Chinese people are present in a big way in the non-resource-rich countries. And this told me that China, this is not just about seeking natural resources from Africa. Yes, China needs natural resources. Yes, China is not shy about competing for natural resources. But the Chinese presence in Africa is spread very widely, including in countries that do not look obviously like big resource plays. And there are a variety of reasons for that. The most important reason for that, I think, is that China sees Africa as a market. That China sees Africa as a place where they can do economic business with. And it's relatively uncompetitive. So if you're going to start up your little company and you don't want to have, you know, you don't want to go head to head with IBM or with, you know, General Motors or with Boeing or with whoever, right? You're going to go to a place where, with a little money and a little ingenuity and a lot of being able to, as Warren said, eat bitter, meaning put up with a lot of stuff, you might have a decent chance to make it. That's what's going on.
Jeff, number 1, number 2, and then number 3 on the aisle, okay? And
Jeff Laurenti. Presumably it also helps that Chinese companies don't have American companies' quarterly earnings time horizon and are able to think in a longer term. I want to ask Howard if on an official track China is very non-judgmental about political virtue in countries in Africa, unlike the Americans, unlike the West Europeans, who are very eager to reform other people's political systems. But to what extent has this been something that gains them influence, popularity outside of presidential palaces? That is, what is the broader African public reaction to or feeling towards China's, we are being charitable in calling it non-judgmental in terms of whom it sleeps with. And related to that, how are Chinese viewed in that swath of Africa where you have a good deal of Islamic jihadist activity bubbling up? Are they viewed there as Westerners are, or are they somewhat insulated from that kind of antagonism?
okay, second question here. I've already chosen.
Dennis Bennett from Afrigrains, which is private food security working in East Africa.
Welcome.
I appreciated your comments about American companies in Africa. It's incredibly difficult to get U.S. government support for any sort of private sector operations. It's also incredibly difficult, just as a side note, it's also incredibly difficult to find U.S. investors who are willing to do it just to get the money to do it. I've been involved in East Africa for over 16 years, as well as global banking all over. So we're doing some things there that are unique, but it's incredibly difficult. You might add to your comments or think about what's the impact of USAID, U.S. foreign policy, and World Food Program They are not buying food produced locally, therefore there's no incentive. They're doing the same thing that we're talking about with the Chinese. They are not buying food locally. Tanzania comes to mind. They could be funding a lot of the food security drops into South Sudan, for example, from Tanzania. No, they're getting it from U.S. farmers, shipping it to Mombasa, and then dropping it out of C-130s. So,
And then I
any
had the
comments?
last question. There you are.
Levi Bautista, United Methodist representative
little louder.
here. Yeah. Levi Bautista, United Methodist representative here at the United Nations. I look forward to reading your book, Mr. French. In your title is the word empire. McKinley's empire, conceiving of the Philippines, came with military backing. Is China, in your usage of the word empire here, is there anything that we should know about a military backing of their presence in Africa? Or are you conceiving of another empire that is no longer of the French, of the Portuguese, the Spanish, or American colonial conquests?
Thank you. Howard, see if you can do that in about 3 or 4 minutes, because, those 3 questions, because
Okay.
then we want to adjourn here and buy some books and have you sign them.
Okay, so interference, the non-interference policy. First of all, I don't believe it's true that China doesn't interfere in domestic politics. I don't have time in 3 minutes to get very far with that. This is a rhetorical stance. It's a pillar rhetorically of Chinese foreign policy, but it has never really been true historically if you look into the details. It may be the default preference of China not to be seen to be obviously interfering in other people's domestic affairs. However, this really cuts both ways with African societies. China is a society, is a state that has great reservations about allowing space for its own civil society. NGOs exist in China, but they exist under very heavy constraints. And, the realm of freedom of expression is highly constrained, et cetera. So Chinese the default reflex of the Chinese state is to deal with other states directly, state to state. China doesn't have good conversation with its own civil society, which makes the system uncomfortable. And so it obviously doesn't have a reflex of dealing with civil societies in other societies. It is comfortable thinking about, in terms of official dialogue. Leaders in countries that are run in an authoritarian way in Africa will be very pleased to deal with someone who says, we don't care what you're doing in your own country. We don't get involved in your internal business. We just come to do business. And we'll call it win-win, right? The leaders might like that a lot, but that is no guarantee that that's going to buy you long-term popularity in terms of your relationship with that society. And African countries, and I hesitate to be too broad in making my generalization, but China is learning slowly that African societies often have very vibrant civil societies, that they have very outspoken media, that they have very vigorous oppositions, that they have very lively conversations that are not suppressed in any way about all manner of things. And so China faces a risk in proceeding too blithely down the path of just talking at a state-to-state level, thinking that it's gaining respect for not interfering in people's internal affairs, because people in the civil society actually may wish for a foreign partner, in fact, often do wish for a foreign partner to stand up for principles that involve their internal affairs. I had many people, and these anecdotes are told, some of them told in my book, tell me in civil societies in various places, look, it's nonsense that we don't like interference. We like interference that's consistent. We like interference that's morally consequent, but we're not just against interference. If someone says that you're their friend and you know that they're heroin addicts or that they're beating their wife or they're doing something else awful, right, and you don't say anything, are you really their friend? People speak like this. And so don't buy the notion that being non-interferer is the end of the conversation, and that African countries will just love that. Certain African leaders will love that. That's all. How do they cope with Islamic, strict Islamic environments? Well, typically by isolating their workers in very closed environments and not exposing them to as much risk. Empire. Thank you for the question. So, you know, we typically think of empire in very sort of stodgy ways based on kind of fairly recent classical examples. Africa is a great backdrop for that. Africa was the scene of great empire building by European countries that came in and in a very short time built and then abandoned colonies. But empire has been a very plastic thing over time and has involved lots and lots of different modes of behavior, many of which have not involved direct governance or the explicit use of military force. Empire has, over the last 500 or 600 years, involved spheres of influence. It's involved concessions, so-called concessions. It has involved colonies, of course. It has involved, if I don't know, where did you say you're from? I'm sorry? Philippines. So in your part of the world, it has involved, you know, in the very earliest phases of European imperialism, it didn't involve the intent to govern anybody. It was to set up trading outposts that were leveraging economic power to determine economic exchange with no pretension whatsoever toward administration. And so what I'm saying in using the word empire in this book is that we're seeing something new that I think arguably will come to fit within this very large construction called empire. It will not, in my view, likely involve many of the things that are most familiar to us when we hear the word empire initially. But when you have this kind of disproportion of economic strength of this one unitary entity called China, 1.3 or 4 billion people, second largest, soon to be largest economy in the world, exerting its immense economic forces on this fragmented place called Africa, of 54 largely very poor societies. There's this disproportionate thing going on in an environment where the Africans often, as I said, with infrastructure, don't have much choice. Hillary Clinton can come in and lecture, but she's not giving practical alternatives to many things, right? And so you have disproportion of force, of resources, of strength, and you have a lack of options. And this combination favors what I will argue is an imperial setup where there's the ability of the weaker party to resist is eroded and gradually perhaps disappears.
Howard, I'm going to call it to a halt. So the book's for sale outside. I'm going to keep him here to sign the books. The bar is open. Howard, thank you so much. I love being back with you again after all these years, but that was very, very informative, and I appreciate you coming here.
Thank you, Warren.